Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Women and girls are constantly bombarded with messages that we should be more confident. Whether it's advice about demanding what we're worth in salary negotiations, or memes that suggest we start moving through the world with the confidence of a mediocre white man. Although such advice might be useful for some contexts, it doesn't account for how race and class shape the politics of confidence to begin with, much less center the perspectives of girls, women, and femmes of color in determining the goals of such confidence. My guest today is curator, community arts educator, and professor Jillian Hernandez, whose interdisciplinary research examines how Black and Latinx women and girls negotiate gender, sexuality, race, and class through cultural production and bodily presentation. In our conversation, Jillian and I discussed the racialized, gendered, and classed politics of confidence, how women and girls of color are challenging the social hierarchies of the art world, what collective creative support looks like in the age of COVID-19, and why building a world where girls, women, femmes, and mothers of color can rest and resist is how Jillian imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jillian.
Thank you, Cathy. This is so exciting.
So you are the author of an amazing new book called Aesthetics of Excess, the Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment. To maybe start off our conversation today, what is that book about and what got you excited about writing it?
The book is about how Black and Latina women and girls negotiate power relations in the U.S. Through their body practices. So practices of dressing up, and presenting themselves to the world, but also artistic practices. So through making art, through making sculptures using their own bodies. And a lot of this work stemmed out of community arts work that I was doing in Miami, Florida, through a collective called Women on the Rise. And it was a project that I founded in 2004. It was myself and a rotating group of amazing women of color artists who would work with girls in the community in Miami. And we would use feminist art to engage the girls in conversations around race, around gender, around sexuality. And the interactions that I was so privileged to engage in with the girls through art just taught me so much about the power of art and aesthetics to really transform how we think about gender, race, and sexuality, but also the enormous potential of the creative just as a tool for sort of connecting with each other and as a tool for making ourselves in the world.
One of what I think is the greatest contributions that this book makes, and there are many, is it puts the voices and the bodies and the worldviews of girls of color at the very center of discussions of cultural capital and aesthetics. And this is something that a lot of these conversations don't do, instead privileging other voices and worldviews. And I'm struck by your methodology in this book and the way that you approach these kinds of questions of cultural capital and aesthetics, race, gender, embodiment through how you engage with your interview subjects. And so I'm curious, what made you want to approach aesthetics in this way, through this kind of methodology?
I think it actually sort of was in a way like the other way around in a way. I think because I started from doing the community arts work, I think for me, the methods in the book very much sort of mirror the methods that we used in Women on the Rise in many ways, in that we use the artwork. So what we would do is we would visit the girls in different places. So it would be an after-school program at a high school. It would be at the juvenile detention center. It would be at a residential drug treatment center. And we would spend about 90 minutes to 2 hours with the girls. And each time we went, it would be a standalone workshop where we would introduce them to the work of a woman artist. So it would be Lorna Simpson or Ana Mendieta. And the girls weren't expected to know anything about art or be trained at all in art history or art. And really, it was about producing dialogue. And in many ways, I think in the book, I use the format of interviews, of group interviews instead of one-on-one interviews, because we did work with the girls as a group to really try to share with the reader how rich the conversations are and how the girls' own theorizations. Oh my God, it's so early in the morning. The ways the girls were theorizing racialization, sexuality. They were theorizing around representations in popular culture. So for me, the book really came from wanting to share these insights of the girls with the scholarly community and beyond in gender and women's studies, in ethnic studies, and art history and visual culture studies. Because I think that these are spaces that, as you mentioned, don't really center even adult people of color, let alone, right, young working class Black and Latina women and girls. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that Women on the Rise was operating through the Museum of Contemporary Art that is in North Miami. And in many ways, the institutional power dynamics of the museum very much sort of restricted even what we could do with the girls, how the work we were doing with the girls was represented. And I think for me, the project became one about telling the story of how, working class girls, contemporary art, and art institutions are intimately related, even though we want to sort of think about them, as like these discrete sort of social and cultural spaces. But through Women on the Rise, myself and other artists in the collective, we were traversing sort of these spaces of the elite art institution and these poor and working class areas in Miami, and sort of what does it mean to move through that? And what did it mean for our bodies, which also signify, even though we were a collective of women of color, our bodies also signified in different ways, different forms of class privilege too. So what did it mean for us to go into these spaces and work with girls? So for me, it was really about telling that story, because I think, now the art world is experiencing quite a reckoning as it concerns issues of race and difference and institutional power. And in my book, this story is being told from the perspective of Black and Latina girls.
Given your kind of long history in the curatorial world and the community arts world, I would love to talk a little bit about how that work for you has shifted recently. I mean, you mentioned the kind of reckoning that the art world more broadly is facing and has been facing for quite some time at this point. But I agree, I think it's coming to a head in terms of public conversations much more intensely. But also we have the enormous shifts that the arts world, and it's really arts worlds, right? Like the different spaces in which art is created, is facing due to COVID. So I'm curious, how has your approach to curatorial work or community arts work shifted in the face of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in many ways, I've just sort of had to have this moment of pausing and really rethinking how to proceed. And it was so sad because one of the things that I was working on organizing with my students at the University of Florida, it was like March 28th was the date, was a perreo. So perreo is an African diasporic dance. Many folks became familiar with perreo through the Verano Intenso in Puerto Rico of 2019, where a lot of folks, a lot of queer and trans folks were using the dance as a form of protest, denouncing Ricardo Rosselló. So we were planning, myself and my students were planning on having a perreo here in Gainesville, and a panel on perreo as queer feminist resistance that we felt like we so needed to have this space to dance together and be together. And to have to cancel it was just so devastating, because it was something that was sort of getting us through the semester at that point, was knowing that the perreo was coming.
Oh.
And I know it was really quite terrible. And I think it's just been so painful, because I think for many of us, those forms of connection are so crucial. those spaces of connection, those spaces of cultural exchange are really so important just for our everyday survival, in addition to being tools of activism. I think for me, I'm starting to think about programming on Zoom, but I think for me, I think everyone is so exhausted. So it's also this feeling of wanting to organize things, but also really just trying to be intentional about what I do and how. And I don't think I've quite figured it out yet. So to be honest, I haven't really done much because I think I'm just still trying to get my footing in this sort of new context that we're in.
I think from folks that I've talked to, that's a really shared experience, particularly when, and I think your point about these kinds of communal, often bodily spaces as tools of survival and community making and learning and cultural exchange. Part of what I'm noticing a lot of folks having difficulty with shifting to an online version is that online version is also where we're doing our work.
Exactly.
And it's often where our kids are, taking their school, or if you're, whatever, it's like where everything else is already living. So it's hard to summon the desire to add yet another Zoom meeting, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I have been really inspired by the versus battles, of course, as many of us have been. And I think some folks are doing this right. So I am a huge fan of Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown's project, Saving Our Lives, Hear Our Truth, otherwise known as Soul Hot. And Soul Hot had a series of Instagram live conversations. And so their work really centers Black girlhood as an organizing principle, as an aesthetic, as a space. And so they had a series of Instagram lives. And what I loved about that was that I didn't have to be in front of my computer. I didn't have to sort of, type a Zoom meeting date into my calendar. It had nothing to do with my email. So if I was available and scrolling on my phone, I could just watch the live, right? So that is something I think I'm going to try out with some programming ideas that I'm working on, because I do like this idea that folks can just sort of jump in, jump out, and it's not so much a space of work so much. So we'll see.
So this month at Ideas on Fire, we're talking quite a lot about confidence and the way that it manifests or doesn't manifest across our various projects in ways that are deeply racialized, classed, and gendered. I'm curious, how are you seeing the politics of confidence play out in the work that you've been doing recently?
I love this question because tomorrow I'm actually going to be talking about the chapter of the book that's on the aesthetics of masculinity. And a lot of my research participants talked a lot about how their forms of masculine embodiment allowed them to sort of perform confidence, right? And in thinking about confidence, I think that word often is so sort of embroiled in these like marketing logics and these like gendered marketing logics and these like neoliberal logics of how to feel good. But I think what I point to in the chapter of the book is how confidence is narrated by the artists and women on the rise, the young women artists and women on the rise. It was really about possessing power, like a feeling of possessing power, right? Rather than a commodity, rather than, something that's being sort of sold to you. And so for me, that confidence is so important to not only sort of facing this world as a gendered and racialized subject, but also in sort of providing yourself the space to engage with the imagination. I mean, I think in Women on the Rise, one thing that we would sometimes have a challenge with was engaging girls in an art project and just having them be so reluctant to make marks on like a white page, and I think many of us understand what that feels like.
The terror of the white
right?
page.
For sure. And I think, that sort of, that kind of feeling, of, it's really a feeling of vulnerability. And no matter how much we worked to make it a space that embraced that vulnerability, that was supportive, right? That was open about risk taking, that was not invested in respectability politics. I think the girls understood that even if, as Women on the Rise, instructors, we were not going to negatively judge them, they understood that we were only there for like 2 hours and we're going to leave, right? So it really sort of made us aware of just how entrenched the policing of Black and Latina girls' expressions, both bodily, verbal, artistic, and in multiple registers are policed. And so confidence, I think if we think about it as a possession of power, then I think it's something that we definitely want to cultivate in various different arenas. And I think particularly through cultural means, aesthetic means, I think the more that we provide resources and help to make possible the sort of expression and the cultivation of this confidence among our Black and Latinx youth, I think it's only going to change the world for the better.
You mentioned judgment, and I think that certainly is at the root of a lot of our anxieties over claiming confidence, particularly for people from marginalized communities and marginalized populations. And a lot of that judgment feels very lonely. It feels like we are the only one who is in this situation of feeling judged. Surely everyone else is perfectly fine and feels super confident all the time. It's just me, right? What are some of your favorite techniques, or either from your own life or that you've seen in the workshops that you mentioned, for building collective support systems to kind of to help manifest that confidence through supportive and collective means?
Yeah, I mean, I think the funny thing about judgment is that even though you are totally right, sometimes it does feel very lonely, and like you're only being targeted. But one thing that I noticed a lot was that in Women on the Rise, the judgment also happens collectively too. So I'm not trying to reiterate the same kind of like mean girl rhetoric that was really popular in the early 2000s. Like all of this work that was around like relational aggression and this idea that like, a lot of this work was centered on middle class white girls, this idea that they might not get into fistfights, but they hurt each other with their words and they're mean to each other, right? So I'm not trying to reiterate that narrative, but among the girls that we worked with, we did witness many dynamics where girls would engage in like sort of collective judgment of each other. And I theorized in the book that it's almost become the only acceptable way to engage with one another, like for women and femmes to sort of engage with one another as a young person who is racialized and understands that in the wider context of, white supremacy, you are viewed as less than. And so rather than just simply sort of bemoaning that, it's important to note it, but also I think the antidote to that and what I saw happen in Women on the Rise is that then if the judgment is happening collectively among the girls judging each other, either for what they thought were, modes of body presentation that they felt were too sexual, or modes of body presentation that they felt were not, fashionable, then collectively as a unit in Women on the Rise, we were going to engage in this sort of alternative collective practice of celebrating women, of sort of centering women, of really engaging with images of the grotesque. And I think that is really where a lot of the richest conversations emerge. So talking about the work of Wangechi Mutu, talking about the work of Shoshana Weinberger, who creates these like wild, grotesque images of Black women's bodies. And so it was precisely through engaging with the most abject representations of women's bodies that I felt like we were doing the most work in really getting to the nitty gritty of like, why do we judge each other? Why do we engage in these dynamics? And how can we, lift each other up and make each other feel, more powerful? And so the art projects that we did there were really interesting because the girls were instructed to sort of like paint grotesque bodies. They were kind of into that. But then one of our instructor artists, Crystal Pearl Molinari, came up with this idea of like, well, let's do like a 3D version of having them make a grotesque. And we brought like these big soft sculptures. We went to like these stores in Miami that folks use to like buy really cheap clothing to like send to Cuba. So you could get like bras and panties for $1. We brought all these bras, all these panties, and we told the girls like, okay, we're going to make a grotesque body using all of these materials. Well, instead of using the dummy, they started to put all of these bras and panties and batting on themselves and making themselves into grotesque. And they had to do it collectively. And it was just amazing to see them manipulate these materials, like create an enormous ass, create a body with like 6 or 10 breasts, right? Laugh, take pictures of each other with their cell phone. So, I think maybe through engaging with the abject, and this is an argument that scholars like Leticia Alvarado make as well, right? That engaging with the abject, engaging with those things that both as a society we shun, and also I think individually we're sort of afraid of our own sort of vulnerability and abjection, that by facing that together as a collective and Women on the Rise, I felt like those were the moments that just felt the most exhilarating.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to talk with folks about that really gets at the heart of why you do the work that you do in the world. And that's that version of a better world that you're working toward when you organize these workshops, when you write your books, when you teach your classes. So I'll ask you this giant question that I love summing up each episode with. What is the world that you're working toward? What kind of world do you want?
I want a world where my family and my friends, many of whom are mothers, caregivers, where they could rest and where they could do more than rest, where they could go about doing the work of changing this world. I want a world that's organized really around the imaginations of women and girls of color. And, many of my friends and family already do this world making, but in engaging in the labor of making our lives possible and better, their own lives are being depleted. And I want to see a world where that's not the cost of that.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of the ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Thank you so much, Cathy. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Persad and myself, Cathy Hannabach. Audio editing was provided by the awesome folks at Pro Podcast Solutions. You can check out the show notes and transcript for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guests and find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.